Hello and welcome to another in Hot Topics occasional series of parliamentary specials. This time our correspondent from Westminster is veteran journalist, scholar and since 1977 Labour MP for Great Grimsby, Austin Mitchell. Welcome, Austin.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on. The big stories in Westminster in January. The one that comes immediately to mind is a change in the economy, a 1.9% growth in the economy. Rather embarrassing for your man, Mr. Balls.
I don't think so. It depends how soundly based and how dynamic this recovery is. It's not very soundly based. It's concentrated mainly in the south. And I think, after 4 years of holding the economy back and cuts and austerity, it's about time we had some growth, isn't it? If you stop beating your head against the wall quite as often, you do feel better. And that's what's happened. This is the most incompetent government I've ever known. They've wasted 4 years, and now they tell us a glimmering of growth, which is 2%. That's very low by historic standards. It's a new miracle, a new dawn. It's crazy.
But what will poor old Ed Balls do in those great bear pit Prime Minister's question times, where he's famous for his gesticulating downwards?
Parliament's got very messy. The economy is improving, it's true. But the government isn't. Really it's deadlocked because they've run out of the programme they agreed on in the coalition. And the Liberals won't let them do the kind of nasty things that the Tories might like to do, right-wing populist things, like kicking out immigrants and
we'll come on to
sending
that,
more people to prison and cutting the expenditure on green energy. And the Tories won't let the Liberals do what they want to do. So there's no legislation. There's nothing for us to do. So we sit in the House of Commons and the two sides just shout at each other, like I'm shouting at you now.
Well, you're more than welcome to shout at me if I can shout back at you. But if there's no legislation and politics is about compromise and there's become a deadlock, that's almost an argument that this month politics is finished.
But the way we run it in Britain is about confrontation. Everything is about confrontation in this country. The law courts, you've got a barrister confronting another barrister, putting the arguments. And it started with asking me about Prime Minister's question time. Well, it's a waste of time. It is a custard pie throwing session in which we throw questions at the Prime Minister like, have you stopped beating your wife lately? And he says, you lot of crooks, and left the economy in a mess. And there's no light or education or information in that. It's a waste of a half an hour to insult each other.
One of the sort of forgotten news stories of this last 4 weeks is that for a couple of sessions of Prime Minister's questions, the thought was that maybe the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition had got together and agreed to have a slightly more serious or a slightly more considered discussion of the issues rather than have the usual shouting and slanging match. Only lasted for a couple of weeks. Do you think there was some attempt there?
It didn't work then. What happens in Prime Minister's question time is that each party arms its troops with questions, tough questions, and with answers on the other side. So they're in fact reading prepared statements with some deterioration in the style and the grammar of the questions. But the Tories are saying how marvellous things are and what a mess the Labour Party left. And we're saying how awful things are. You're taking money out of the north, you're taking money from the poor. The cuts are damaging northern councils and public services generally. And there's no meeting of minds. So if there was an attempt to deal with it on a more rational level, it failed.
But there's no meeting of minds because the two positions are forever irreconcilable, aren't they? The idea of let's not take away money from the people who've earned it to give it to the people who haven't got that good luck is not reconcilable. That idea of liberty is not reconcilable with the idea of people are suffering, let's provide them and ameliorate their suffering, and that ideal of equality. And those two ideals of liberty and equality since 1789 have been incompatible.
The debate is how we deal with an economic problem, and we have a problem of low growth, the problem of not paying our way in the world, and the problem of a weak economy because we've deindustrialised and lost industry and manufacturing, which used to pay our way. 60% of our trade came from manufacturing, and that's reduced and fallen down as a proportion of the population. And the problem is how you deal with that. Now the Tories say you deal with it by cutting out government waste, cutting out regulations, setting industry free. That doesn't work in my view. You deal with it, in my view, by expanding demand, by spending money, by building houses to put people back to work, and by investing in manufacturing industry. That's what we're not doing. Well, and that's why the economy is weak and going to get worse.
That's a debate forever. We're just talking about January for the moment and reporting on that.
Well, it's as real in January as it was last year.
Can I ask you about changes closer to home in your own house, as it were? Ed Miliband would like to change the rules for the election of the Labour Party leader. It has been a third elected by the unions, a third by the membership of the party, and a third by the Labour MPs. He's suggesting that it should now be an election only by the membership of the party, so that a leader might not necessarily have the support of all the MPs sitting behind him in the House. What do you think?
Well, he didn't have the support of the majority of MPs when he was elected. I think it's silly. I think it's a waste of time. And I think it's damaging to our relations with the trade unions. The trade unions are affiliated to the party. Those unions which are affiliated help support the Labour Party, just as big business finances the Tory party. You can't ask trade unionists to join as individual members because they won't. A proportion will, but most won't. That means our individual membership will fall. So he's talking about having the election by a diminishing number of members, all of whom are individual members rather than through their trade union. And I think that's just not going to work. The trade unions have to make their decision, the constituency parties have to make their decision, and the PLP has to make their decisions. And then through the amalgam of that, you get a leader.
But without that amalgam, without some sort of electoral college, as it's known, there's a possibility of a man standing up at the dispatch box for the Labour Party, either in government or in opposition, or a woman, knowing perfectly well that everybody behind him can't stand him, that they didn't want him.
That's not true.
That the members of Parliament wanted somebody other than the person they have representing them.
Well, that's...
Or is that the case now?
The possibility has always been there since...
Is it the case now?
The PLP stopped electing the leader, which it used to. And some will argue for just going back to the Parliamentary Labour Party. The Tories have also broadened their electoral base. So I think
it did them no good. They wound up electing Ian Duncan Smith and Michael Howard.
It's right that you involve people outside Parliament, whether they're individual members or trade union members, and the other parties have done the same. The problem is how you balance those three sections and who should be dominant.
Just to bring in one other party from news from January, the Liberal Democrats seem to have managed to have a sex scandal and nobody enjoying it at all. How have they managed to get themselves into such a pickle?
Well, they're a very fussy party. They like to run around in small circles, being purer than pure.
It's largely the media and the press's fault. We're a prurient nation, but it is strange that what might destroy a party's chances is human weakness rather than a matter of philosophy or ideology or policy. Well, is this the right way to conduct politics?
Human weaknesses occur in every party. The problem is how you deal with them. And in this case, clearly, Clegg has fobbed off the issue and said, I'm not going to punish Lord Renard, whatever his name was.
Yep.
He should apologise. Well, his supporters say, why should he apologise if he hasn't done anything wrong? And that's the stalemate. Only a naive party could get itself into that situation, but they have. Lord Greaves, I see, says that bottom nipping was part of the climate in the 1970s. Well, I must say, I've been going to the House of Lords for 30 years. I've never had my bottom nipped, so
I'm not entirely surprised.
I must go in and see what it's like.
Not surprised to hear it, but there is also this issue with the Tory party, the Liberal Democratic Party, that they're saying, no, it can't be proved that you've done anything wrong. Please apologise anyway and acknowledge that you've done nothing wrong, which is a bit of a contradiction of the old law of innocent until proved guilty.
Yep. But I'll leave them to resolve it.
Okay.
It's nothing to do with me, and I'm not interested.
You're not going to intrude in private grief. Okay. In that case, Austin Mitchell, before we come to the next issue, we must take a short break. Please join us again in a few moments. We'll be back in a minute. Thank you very much.
If it had an independent currency, it would be in the same position, but it's not. It can keep the pound.
Welcome back. I'm with Austin Mitchell, Labour MP for Great Grimsby, and he's reporting to us about the last month in Parliament and politics. Austin, one of the other big events in January has been Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England's speech in Edinburgh. in which he was ambiguous about the nature of the Scottish currency still remaining the pound should Scotland choose to be independent. Why should he be ambiguous? Is it possible or is it not?
Well, I think it's possible for Scotland to have home rule and keep the pound and keep the Queen. He was trying to warn us on the lines of the European problem, where a number of economies at widely differing stages of development and investment and competitiveness have amalgamated their currencies, and that does not work because it's impossible for economies, less competitive economies like Italy and Greece or Portugal, to compete with the level of efficiency and investment and competitiveness in Germany, because they'll never do it. The only way they can do it is by adjusting their currency. The euro stops them doing that. Now, that doesn't apply in what's now the United Kingdom, which may be two separate kingdoms, because the two economies are at fairly comparable levels. Scotland needs support, it's true, but if it had all the oil revenues, it would have that kind of support for industry. So if two economies are at a fairly close level, it's possible to have a currency unit. If they're fairly disparate, you can't.
But it's still so easy to see the scenario where a reunion would be necessary. If the Bank of England, which supports the pound, and that's the currency that they have in Scotland, if the Bank of England supports that because it's underwritten by the English taxpayer after independence, then it would be the English taxpayer underwriting the Scottish currency. And if the Scots did need to devalue, for instance, as the Greeks would love to against the Germans...
That wasn't Carney's argument. Carney's argument was that if...
No, it's mine, though. It's my hypothesis.
Well, you're wrong.
I'm happy to be
Carney's
told so,
argument
but why?
was that if the Scottish government overspends or spends irresponsibly, that would weaken the pound and the consequences would fall on the English economy. Well, that's true, but I don't think they will. And I think in the oil revenues, they've still got a strong enough position not to need to do that. So I think he was just sort of firing a warning shots, which you'll notice papers on the right said was a warning, don't have home rule. Papers on the left said, well, it shows that the Scottish government can act independently to an adequate degree and keep the pound. So everybody took different interpretations from it.
And Mark Carney, the present governor of the Bank of England, is a Canadian central banker who's spent most of his career worrying about Quebec going separate and what currency they're going to have there. So well, is this a brilliant appointment for a Bank of England to choose a Canadian?
It's also had to worry about the disparity between the US dollar and the Canadian dollar. The Canadian dollar is now slightly higher than the US dollar. They aren't the same currency, but he's also had to worry about the relativities. And an independent Scottish government, if it had an independent currency, would be in the same position, but it's not. It can keep the pound.
Political consequences of Scottish independence will be coming up this month as well. If Scotland were no longer to send members to the House of Commons, what's the consequence for the Labour Party if it doesn't have the Scottish seats?
Disastrous.
Would it be an abandonment of international socialism if the Scots were to go independent?
It would be more difficult to ever get a Labour majority again. One consequence would be that we'd have to have proportional representation in England to ensure that the Tories did not overwhelmingly dominate, as we had to have proportional representation in Scotland to ensure that Labour didn't dominate. Well, we did that. Now England would have to follow
the Scottish Parliament.
if they were separate, but they won't vote for separation.
But well, we've got to just
I'll put that in writing for you if you want. We'll come back in several months.
Well, let's have a bet of £5 Scottish on it.
Okay.
Okay.
You're on.
Okay, Austin Mitchell. Well, just come back to the Westminster Parliament. There's been a rebellion recently by Tory MPs over the matter of immigration, and Tory MPs wanting to force through an amendment to an immigration bill allowing the Home Secretary to send foreign-born people who are convicted of a crime and to deport them and to send them away. This was not originally government policy, and the government rather capitulated in the face of its rebel backbenchers. Who's governing this country?
Well, Cameron had to rely on the Labour Party to get his own policy through. And I think I made a mistake in that vote. I should have voted with the Tory rebels. I think people who commit criminal offences should be sent back. And it's ridiculous to allow them to plead a right to family life, and they've infringed that right and denied that right by their crime. So I would have voted with them, but I came down to vote, and I was stopped by the Labour whips, not physically, but by detained in argument about what I should do. And the whip said, "Oh, we're going to abstain." And I was saying, why are we abstaining? Tell me. And in that argument, the door shut and I couldn't get in. Well, so my sympathy is with the Tory rebels.
That's dirty play by the whips then, isn't it? Not the first time?
No, it just gets, you've got to push past them and trample on them.
It's a contact sport, politics.
Yes, contact sport. And I'm not very good at that.
There's another issue, though. I mean, back only about 40 years ago, 50 years ago, if the government lost its vote in the House of Commons, as it might have done last night, then it would either go straight to the country or it would call it a vote of confidence. Now, do you think that the backbenchers, Liberal or Conservative, there's a big cadre of rebels on those benches, do you think they'd risk forcing the government into a vote of confidence when we have a delicate Parliament?
No. They'll never do that. The rebels will never rebel far enough to endanger the life of the government. And if they do, and they won't, if they did, the government will always call a vote of confidence. And in that, they'll vote with the government. They'll be forced to. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas.
OK. Final question about your own party leadership. There's been speculation, as you suggested a moment ago, that the Labour Party, if returned to power, would return to a 50% rate top rate of income tax. Now, this has caused various arguments, one of which is whether or not that would actually bring in more revenue for the Treasury in income tax. But secondly, the 50% rate seems very high. I have no brief for millionaires, sadly, but even at a 45% top rate as we have now for everything over £150,000, 1% of the population provides more than a third of all the income tax revenue of the government. Does that seem a little harsh?
Well, I mean, remember it was 60 pence under Mrs Thatcher. They now reduced it to 45.
But Mrs Thatcher was a rabid socialist.
Mrs Thatcher was a rabid socialist in that sense. And if you adjusted it in terms of the real value of the money, it would now be higher than that. Look, the arguments are contradictory, because on the one hand they say not many people will pay it, there won't be much revenue from it. On the other hand, they say, this is terrible, it'll ruin capitalism and drive the rich out of the country. Well, if they're not paying it, and the rich have very smart tax advisors, it's no threat, is it? So I think it is a gesture, but it's a gesture we've got to make. This country has become very unequal. The poor are being pushed down, the benefits are being cut, credits are being cut. The rich have been shot up the table.
That's one way of putting it. The country has become very unequal in that the rich are paying a third of everybody's bills. 1% are paying a third of everybody's taxation.
They are richer. They need to pay more. They've done well out of the recession. And they're well insulated against recession. So property values, the value of their houses, their assets have increased enormously. They can afford to contribute more, and they should.
One final thought. European elections are coming up. Labour Party, your party, is on the whole a Europhile party. You would like to come out of Europe. How will you be voting?
Oh, I shall say, if there's power there, we've got to try and get it. I think in the European elections, UKIP will do well. I think that'll be a protest vote. Most of it will come from the Conservatives. Some of it will come from Labour. And but it'll fade away next time at the general election.
OK. Austin Mitchell, thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I won't fade away next time.
I'm sure you won't. I have no doubt of it. I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you for coming along.
Thank you.
And I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Please join us next week for another hot topic. For now, goodbye.